at Vanderbilt, for example, by 1953 they had already desegregated their graduate divinity school. By 1956, Vanderbilt had desegregated its law school. No other schools actually went ahead and desegregated anything, but it was always there. Tulane, for example, was within a hair's breadth of deciding to desegregate when the day before the board was supposed to meet, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down Brown versus Board of Education, and that brought that to a total halt. It was one thing to voluntarily desegregate your graduate school when nobody would notice, but it was another thing after Brown. And Brown has a real dampening effect on any moves to desegregate at any of these schools. I've never found anything at Rice, any document anywhere that ever discusses in any way Brown versus Board of Education, but I know they talk about it, and just knowing how conservative these guys were, there was just no way that they were going to take any kind of a step that would upset the apple cart. The political environment in Houston through the 50s and into the 60s became almost crazily anti-communist. There were school board elections where people ran on an anti-UN platform. So there was just literally no chance of anybody stepping out in any really aggressive way. Again, sometimes the students would, depending on who was the editor of the Thresher. William P. Hobby was editor in 1951, and he wrote some pretty strongly worded editorials in favor of desegregation. In 1953, there was a poll of the Rice student body that showed 57% support for an admissions policy based on merit with no consideration of race. There were a couple other things like this. There were football games where Rice would have been playing a team, Cornell, for example, that had a black player. And then there would be some sort of upset around that. He wasn't allowed to stay with the rest of his team, and so there's a Thresher editorial, about the unfairness of that. But by and large, the Rice administration just let this stuff go. They didn't respond in any way. They would not be provoked. They would not be moved. And apart from those few things, there wasn't a lot of stirring here in the 50s. At one point, in 1958, the board did have its lawyers investigate a 1958 Supreme Court opinion involving restrictions at another private college, but they concluded that the opinion didn't make them do anything, and so they didn't do anything. And there was nothing that happened really that would provoke any significant reassessment of race relations on the Rice campus, which in fact there weren't any above the level of staff, menial staff, janitors and groundskeepers and things like that. They sailed through the 50s as though it were a non-issue, as though in fact there were nothing going on. But there was something going on, and in particular, what was going on was what I mentioned earlier about the funding sources. The Northern Foundations in particular, Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, which were the workhorses in terms of supplying funding to Southern universities, they were getting more and more unhappy about this continued segregation on these campuses. And they were becoming less and less willing to simply hand over money to these schools if they weren't going to change. And the federal government, again, each successive administration promulgated a non-discrimination clause in federal contracting that was stricter than the one before it. So by 1959, 1960, this is very strict indeed, and it becomes a real problem. The other thing is that Rice's financial advantage has begun to dwindle. The cost of providing the kind of education that you could get at Rice had escalated dramatically. It was approximately $300 per student per year in 1941. By 1962, it was $2,700 per student per year. Now, in spite of the sound financial position that they started the post-war era in, I mean, the investments simply couldn't keep up with that kind of escalation in cost. So, you know, their financial position was gradually degraded. Now, they can't get any money back by charging tuition. And this problem is compounded by the fact that enrollment has been allowed to grow from about 1,500 in 1949 to about 2,400 in 1962. So we're getting squeezed. And partly in response to these kinds of pressures, by the mid to late 1950s, Rice began to explore the possibility of attracting major federal money. And what they had in mind was involving this land down in Clear Lake. Now, Rice owned some land down there, but it also understood through the board that it had access to even more through the Humble Oil and Refining Company, which had its own reason for wanting a major federal research installation down there. So what happens is, by about 1956, 1957, this sort of team gets together. And this team consists of William Houston, Cary Cronice, who was the provost at the time, George R. Brown, who was chairman of the board at Rice, and Albert Thomas, our congressional representative and Rice grad. And they begin to try to cut a deal. And these guys know how to cut a deal. But they have trouble finding a taker. Their first thought is they want to use that land to attract a major nuclear reactor. They want to get the Atomic Energy Commission, which has announced that it's going to build one, to build it down on that land. And you know, they use every trick in the book. I mean, Albert Thomas and his buddy Lyndon Johnson are leaning on everybody and anybody in Washington who they think can help them get this reactor. And in the end, they don't get it. It winds up, I think, outside Chicago. So they try again the next year, 58, 59, they try it again. They go back, there's a new AEC director, and they get all their buddies to lean on him, and again, they don't get a project. So they're sitting and they're trying to figure out what to do next. They actually have to, Albert Thomas has to talk the Rice administration out of just giving up and building some small, geological lab. He's like, oh no, no, we can get a big deal. And having been shut out twice, he was even more determined that he was going to get a big project. So this is what's going on when, in the meantime, President Houston becomes ill and eventually resigns. And they begin to look for a new president. And this was back in the day when the board picked who was the president. There's no faculty committees. There's no student committees. They just figure out who they want, and then they go and try to get them. And the guy that they decided they wanted was Kenneth Pitzer, this very distinguished chemist from Stanford, member of the National Academy of Sciences. And I believe that a big part of Pitzer's appeal to these guys, I mean, aside from his just obvious intellectual ability, was that he had incredibly close ties to the federal research apparatus. In the 1940s, he'd been director of research for the Atomic Energy Commission, and he was one of the people who was most instrumental in forging close ties between the federal scientific and technical funding agencies and the universities after the end of the war. So George R. Brown and another trustee, Newton Razor, they were clearly anticipating, when they went to see Kenneth Pitzer, some kind of a major push forward for Rice. Under Houston, it had grown in size, but it had really not taken advantage of the financial opportunities that were floating around after the war. And I think they saw this as a chance to get a guy who could lead Rice forward in a major way, which indeed he could. Pitzer, though, has got a problem. Brown and Razor go out to see him, and he's amenable, but he tells them that he won't come as long as Rice stays segregated. Well, Brown and Razor assure him that we've already talked about this, and this isn't going to be a problem. We will get rid of this problem as quickly as we can. So Pitzer comes, and the very first board meeting that he ever attends is in September of 1961, and the issue comes up. Pitzer, when he came to Rice, he brought with him a federal research grant that had in it a newly stringent non-discrimination clause. This is the first agenda item in the first meeting he ever attends. I think I've actually got it here. Yes, September 27th, 1961. Mr. Razor reported receipt of a proposed research contract with the Atomic Energy Commission for execution in connection with the continuation of a project in which Dr. Pitzer was engaged before coming to Rice. He stated that in view of the inclusion in the contract of a new and much more stringent non-discrimination clause, it had been reviewed by Mr. Lovett, who is Malcolm Lovett, Edgar Odell Lovett's son, who's a Rice board member and an attorney, and discussed at length in the meeting of the Faculty, Student, and Alumni Committee held on Tuesday of this week. He stated further that although a majority of the committee favored approval, the matter was being submitted for full discussion by the entire board. At Mr. Razor's request, Mr. Lovett reviewed the clause, pointing out that execution of the contract would not only obligate the university to full compliance as to the provisions thereof, but would also mean assumption of responsibility for compliance by its suppliers and subcontractors. After full discussion, which must have been interesting, with Dr. Pitzer and board members speaking to the point, execution of the contract was authorized. Now, here comes the good part. It was also the sense of the meeting that the university's attorneys should be requested to give consideration to all restrictions contained in its charter and in the indenture from William Marsh Rice pursuant to which the university was established, including those relating to the class or classes of persons who may be accepted as students and the charging of tuition, and to advise this board fully concerning their views and recommendations on ways and means of accommodating the operation and affairs of the university to broader policies of admission. Okay, so at Pitzer's first meeting, they don't just approve his contract. They essentially make the decision that they've got to do something about this admissions policy if they're going to be able to accept grants in the future. These clauses are very troubling, and their treatment of the clauses is very, very troubling. I mean, they really played kind of fast and loose with these contracts. In 1957, they got one from the Atomic Energy Commission. It was a relatively small grant, and it was for training. They were using AEC equipment in the nuclear lab to train juniors and seniors, essentially. And in that contract, part of the non-discrimination clause says this: the grantee agrees that no person shall be barred from participation in the training program involved, or be the subject of other unfavorable discrimination on the basis of race, creed, color, or religion. All right? Well, they decided they could go ahead and sign that. The reason that they could go ahead and sign it is because the laboratory equipment made available by these funds under this grant will be used in connection with courses which are offered only to students of the Rice Institute who are in their 4th or 5th year. It's like, okay. That is sort of completely in violation of what the intent of that clause is. The clause says, you know, you can only have this money if you will swear to us that there's no racial discrimination in determining who gets trained with it. And they say, oh, well, there's no racial discrimination in determining who gets trained with it because only Rice students get trained with it. But all Rice students can be trained with it. It's like, you know, again, it's Clinton-esque. And they were playing with fire here because among the penalties for violation of this clause is not just revocation of the grant, but ineligibility for all future grants from the Atomic Energy Commission. And for a school, you know, whose pride and joy was a physics program that was funded almost exclusively by the Atomic Energy Commission, it was madness to sign that thing. But they signed it anyway, and nothing, in fact, happened to them. You know, why, I can't say. But it was completely disingenuous. So they did have to make a change because, you know, the political climate was changing so much that they weren't going to be able to get away with this forever, and they knew it.